what it means. I have to let you also know that we, the people, the African people, are very serious about the UNIACL and what it's all about. Let me read to you the preamble of the Constitution, which will give you a description of what we are, what we ought to be if we are not, as it is said, and where our target is. The Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League is a social, friendly, humanitarian, charitable, educational, institutional, constructive, and expansive society, and is founded by persons desiring to the utmost to work for the general uplift of the Negro peoples of the world. And the members pledge themselves to do all in their power to conserve the rights of their noble race and to respect the rights of all mankind, believing always in the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God. The motto of the organization is one God, one aim, one destiny. Therefore, let justice be done to all mankind, realizing that if the strong oppresses the weak, confusion and discontent will ever mark the path of man. But with love, faith, and charity towards all, the reign of peace and plenty will be heralded into the world, and the generations of men shall be called blessed. I'm sorry if it sounds like a little bit churchy, but yeah, we're preaching to you. We want you to know who we are, and we want you to know what you ought to be. Okay, you ought to be a member of the UNIACL. You ought to, if you're an African, you are a member of the UNIACL. Of course, to be an active member, you have to pay some dues. It means you have to sign up, pay your dues, etc., and so forth. Well, let's not go any further into that. Let me do something else. Greetings again. This is the Freedom Friday Forum. Tonight, our theme is reparations. And I would like to start out with the second Assistant President General, but since she is indisposed at the moment, I will then go to Baba Senghor as the first Assistant President General to just greet folks in the meantime. Okay?
And then we will move forward. I bring greetings to everybody. We got a packed house of brothers and sisters who've been at the movement works for a long time. Baba Mosi, thank you. I also serve as an active member of Division 330, but I'm also acting president of Division 369 and also serve as first assistant. We have in the house with us tonight, my good brother, Robert Stubblefield, and we are anxious to hear from him. And I suggest, Baba Mosi, after I finish, you start with him. That's my suggestion, because we all about the future and the youth. And I believe he may be one of the youngest presenters that we have. So if it's okay with him, I'd hope he could start off. And then we have my good brother, Kamm Howard, who has been working and in the UNIA, by the way, and been working for a long time on the issue of reparations. And Dr. ChenizRa, who is also the second Assistant President General and also High Commissioner General, is very aware of the reparations movement. I will say real quickly that I am working with the reestablishment of NCOBRA in Washington, D.C., because it's been out of existence for a while. I will give a little update later on. We also have the President General of the UNIA with us, and Baba Akili, Akili Malik Nkrumah, and I would hope he holds some of his comments until he hears some of the presenters, but certainly I know he's going to have a lot to share, because we're not only talking about going after Yurugu for reparations, we're talking about our own internal repair. We also have our good brother, active UNIA member and a long-time activist in the movement, who has done work in Haiti, done work in Africa, still doing work, Brother Paul Pumphrey. And so we're gonna have a real education with ourselves, and we also are speaking truth to power for the critical mass so people can have an update on why we need reparations, restitution, and justice now. I would be remiss if I did not let everybody know that we've called on all Africans, North, South, East, and West, to exonerate Marcus Garvey. We ain't asking no government or no, not even a black government other than our government. And our President General signed a decree on August the 31st, and we're gonna be pushing that like I don't know what. Some people say, well, why now? Well, we have been working to emulate Garvey for some time, so we know he was not guilty. However, a lot of people talk about Garvey but don't understand the importance of exonerating him in their mind. And as Garvey taught us, you have to come out of mental slavery in your mind in order to do the kind of work we need to do for internal reparations. UNIA, since I've been in it, even when I came in as a cub, was talking about internal repair. So we're not just going to talk about what's happening in the United States, we're going to talk about what's happening around the globe. So without any further ado, I'm going to give it back to my good brother, Baba Mosi, and I hope we can get started with my good brother, Robert, if that's in order, because Dr. Chen says she will be with us. Just go forward. She's ready and anxious to be a part of this reasoning, but she's a grandmama first. And as y'all know, our sisters don't play. When it comes to taking care of the new sisters coming in the world and the new brothers, they do that well. And Dr. ChenizRa does that very well. And for those who do not know who Dr. ChenizRa is, they will know tonight. So without any further ado, back to you, Baba Mosi.
Okay, let me unmute myself. Oh, I did. Okay. Well, Robert, somebody requested that you start, and Robert is a researcher, and let me say, the expert in and part. I think is a committee on the committee of reparations in the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition in Bethesda, Maryland. And Robert, let me let you explain or to the folks what you're up to in the BACC or in any other position where you are dealing with reparations.
Okay, thank you, Baba Mosi, and thank you, Baba Senghor, for the introduction. I just want to say first, thank you to everyone, who are here tonight. This is definitely a much needed discussion and a much needed, I would like to say, planning session, in terms of the fact that what we need to do. One of the things I hope we can get out of this meeting is figure out steps forward in terms of coalition building and helping build and establishing what other people around, not just the US, but internationally are doing for reparations. As Baba Mosi mentioned, my name is Robert. I'm with the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, and I'm on the Reparations Committee. I would like to start off by saying, when it comes to reparations, there are two important things that we need to discuss. What exactly are reparations and why reparations are necessary? What reparations are, to me, and in my opinion, it's repair and restoration. Pretty much restoring people, to what they would have been had not the Mafa or the Manamizi, the Great Suffering, had not taken place. And all the BS that has come with it. And why reparations are so necessary, especially now at this point in time in 2022, is for the simple fact that we built not just the United States, but we built the Caribbean, we built Latin America, and even prior to all that, before the European colonization, we were building up throughout Africa. But yet in many places, whether you were dealing with imperialism in Africa or throughout the diaspora, we were not allowed or forbidden to taking part in the bounty that came with the sweat and fruits of our labor. This is seen all throughout the country, in terms of the fact when you look at Tulsa and Rosewood and Wilmington, North Carolina. But I also want to talk about places you may not have heard about, such as River Road in Montgomery County in Bethesda, Maryland, which was a once thriving African-American community, but due to a wave of displacement, not only was that this community displaced and dispersed out throughout the DMV, but their cemetery was desecrated. And the only thing that remains of that area that reminds people that there once was a thriving African-American community is in fact the Macedonia Baptist Church. Now, I know some people may be asking, well, what does the desecration of a cemetery have to do with reparations? The short answer is everything. And the reason why that is everything, because that's part of what is known as land theft. In fact, there was an article that came out a few years ago, around 2016, 2017, that said that African Americans in the United States have lost about $16 billion in wealth, intergenerational wealth, because of land theft. When you think about farms that were stolen away, when you think about towns that were destroyed, when you think about communities that were displaced, that even to this very day, we're still dealing with that trauma. That alone is why reparations are necessary. But we also have to talk about reparations from the fact that things we are still suffering from, the failed war on drugs, the fact that we are thrown in prison for harsher sentences, even if it's the same crime as comparison to our European counterparts. We also must seek reparations for an unjust school system. We must also seek reparations for slavery and its after effects, because all those things that I mentioned are interconnected. And when you try to, some communities will say we need to get reparations for school desegregation, which I am in agreement with. And while together that is strong, when we interconnect it with the other issues that I mentioned, our argument becomes impossible to ignore. And we see that there is progress being made in discussions. You had some contingent led by Nicole Hannah-Jones, where they were at the Vatican discussing reparations with Pope Francis. And we got to talk about how the church played a role in the heinous crimes against humanity known as slavery. We are also seeing, especially now with the recent passing of Queen Elizabeth II, how current African countries in the Commonwealth, like South Africa, like Jamaica, are not only demanding to leave the Commonwealth, but they're demanding, as they do, reparations. Jamaica alone is demanding $13 billion, at least in US dollars, from the UK because they want to leave the Commonwealth, because there's nothing good for them, because it's time for Jamaica to stand on its own. And you see that spirit of Garveyism in Jamaica's own home country. You also see it taking place in South Africa with groups like the Economic Freedom Fighters and the Black is Back Land First and Black Land First Coalition in South Africa demanding reparations. But reparations is more than just cash payments. It is a holistic, it is a comprehensive plan. Yes, cash is necessary, but land is necessary. That's something that everybody from Garvey to Malcolm X to Dr. King to Kwame Nkrumah knew, because they knew that land is justice, because land is power. It is the source of all power. It is the return of historic lands. In addition to places like River Road and Bethesda, there's also a community trying to get land back in PG County known as Lakeland, which also suffered displacement. You also have the horror and the tragedy in places like Lake Lanier in Georgia, where a Black town was destroyed to make way for a lake. And at the bottom of that lake, that town's cemetery and school are still intact. But that lake is considered haunted because they knew what they did was wrong. It also, when we talk about reparations, it has to be internal. And I think internal and external have to go in hand. And part of reparations is that, one is that there has to be true education, which tells the true history and the impact of why this is necessary. It's also dealing with the healing in terms of the cause of the trauma. Because when people take a look at what's going on, how people act, it's a symptom of a much larger problem. Is that if you want to get rid of someone's problem, you can't just deal with the symptom. You have to go to the root cause, which is usually some form of trauma that happened when they're young. But when you take a group of people that for over 400 years have had trauma passed on from generation to generation to generation, that has to be fixed. Because even once we get reparations, and I think that I feel and believe that we are going to get them, it would do us no good if we spend that money or turn those resources back to the powers that be. Let us use the time to invest in ourselves. Yes, investing in our own business and enterprises. Yes, and investing in our own communities. But let us use that to also invest in our healing. Let us take places like River Road, what we're trying to do, for example, turn that into a museum in a sacred space where, yes, we can not only help out other issues within the diaspora, but use that as a place of healing for a community. In fact, I was reading something the other day, how a group of people in South Carolina bought a plantation and turned it into a healing center. I think that that is part of the issue, because I think that's part of internal reparations in terms of healing ourselves, because in order to do that, it's time that we also reclaim places of trauma, because all that has to go hand in hand with the external planning and with the internal. In terms of what we're doing on the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition right now, currently in terms of reparations, that we are currently working, developing a study and an action plan. The study to lay out the cause of the harm and the trauma and tells the truth. And I'm not talking about the romanticized truth that gets watered down. I am talking about the ugly truth, the brutal truth, the truth that will set you free, but will first piss you off truth. And then we're going to get into the solutions that are necessary. And again, it has to be comprehensive and local, and it has to start, to use this as part of local reparations movements, to connect with those to see what they're doing, where they succeeded, and how that can be adapted. In fact, and I'm actually glad that Brother Kamm Howard is on here, because I happen to have his book in terms of guidelines for local reparations. And that is a very key guideline right there in terms of the fact that we must connect with other local groups throughout the country, so that way we can drive the reparations conversation nationally. But not only can we drive the conversation nationally, and Brother Kamm can probably talk more about this a little bit better than I can, but also take people who have worked on these local reparations, develop these action plans and studies, and put them on the working group at the national level. And the reason why that is important is because, and I'm just going to keep it real, I don't trust the same politicians that are causing harm to all of a sudden do a reparations plan. Because to me, that is like asking the wolf and the fox to guard the hen house and have the audacity to wonder why our chickens keep disappearing. For us, it is those of us who put in the blood, the sweat, the tears, the hours, and actually work. And I mean, work on that committee so we can actually show what a true comprehensive holistic study and action plan looks like for the United States. And then I feel that at the same time we're doing things locally, we must also connect with what's going on internationally. That means working with groups like CARICOM, helping try and get reparations from the Caribbean, like Jamaica, Barbados, the Bahamas, etc. And also looking at throughout places on the motherland, like what Ghana is trying to do, what Nigeria is trying to do, what South Africa is trying to do. These are just a couple of the countries these are just a couple places that I can think of, and there are plenty more. And on that note, I am going to pass the mic over to Brother Kamm Howard, and I just want to say, I'm so glad that he is here, a man who's been putting in the blood, sweat, and tears in his own right for the past decade and some change. So Brother Kamm, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, my brother.
Thank you, Brother Kamm. Let me thank you, Brother Robert. That was a pretty good opening statement. I'm sure there's going to be some other things you have to say. If you guys knew anything about cricket, I would have told you what the opening batsman has to do. He actually has to set the pace for making the winning runs for that team. And you did a good job, Brother Robert, as the opening batsman. So now let me move to Brother Kamm, who I know you mentioned his name, you showed us his book and all that. Brother Kamm, you've got a fan there, and you've got an admirer, and you've got somebody who has a lot of respect for the things you have to say. So you go right ahead, sir.
Well, thank you. And I wouldn't call the brother a fan or admirer. I would call him one of our new voices and actors in the movement. This is intergenerational. So, we're lucky to have him. And our brother stated almost, all we need to touch, what we need to say on the subject. One of the things I want to start off by saying is that, the reparations movement has always been a global movement. It's never been just a localized American movement. There's always been a global movement. And when we even hear about the term internal reparations, most of us don't know that that term was coined by Professor ChenizRa in the 1993 paper that he delivered at the Abuja Reparations Conference. And he coined the term internal reparations. What are the resources internally that we can use to repair ourselves? So even as we use that term, we're using the term that was shared with us and given to us as a result of our global stand to push this whole notion of repair forward. And it's, very, very much at this particular time, there's so much happening on the global level. As you know, we were in, my brother just mentioned, we were at the Vatican. But before we went to the Vatican, we were at Bellagio in Italy as a Rockefeller resort there, compound there, educational compound. And Nicole Hannah-Jones was invited to Bellagio as a fellowship, and she invited many others in the movement, several others in the movement to come, where we can have high-level discussions to learn from each other, to share our knowledge, brothers and sisters from America, from Europe, from the continent. And it was a small group, intimate group, and we came away with about 15 takeaways, and just on a few of them were one, to consolidate and expand the movement. Consolidating means that we're doing things all around the world, but a lot of us don't know what we're doing. And we're repeating things, or we're not moving in a way that we can move faster and more forcefully. Have we not been more in tune with? So we want to consolidate, move forward as one, similar to how it was in Durban. The brothers and sisters moved forward as one to get the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and colonialism and apartheid to be declared crimes against humanity, to make it clear that there was an economic component to those crimes and that reparations was due. So as they moved collectively in a consolidated manner in Durban, one of the things that came out is we need to consolidate our movement globally at this particular time. And in consolidating, they also stated, or we also agree that we also need to expand the movement, consolidate and expand, meaning bring more voices, assist more nations create reparations commissions. So as we're bringing voices together, we also want to bring more voices to the table. Here in America as well, we had to expand what we're doing here in America, to bring more voices like my brother who just spoke. It's important that, one of the things I've stated for at least the last 10 years is that the reparations movement belongs to every African on the planet. Doesn't belong to one individual, doesn't belong to one organization, but we all have a obligation, a responsibility and duty to fight for repair. And for me, repair is the means in which we get to what Marcus Garvey called Black redemption. It is, repair for repair's sake, we need to be repaired, but the supreme outcome must be a redeemed African world. And so as envisioned by the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. So it has always been for me a part of the revolution, a part of the Black redemption struggle to fight for reparations and repair. So that was one of the takeaways from Bellagio. Another one was that we wanted to come together and kind of create a shared definition of reparations. That was something that was very important. We wanted to develop a shared narrative that we can use. And one of the things that I pointed out while we were there, and I pointed it out in the crowd after we left, came back from Rome and Bellagio and went to Ghana, I pointed it out there and it was adopted in Accra, that we moved forward in our narrative from the position of Durban. Durban gave us the model and the foundation. Crimes were committed, injuries result, and reparations are due. Crimes, injury, repair. And whether we're talking about Africans in the diaspora, and that was another thing, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but whether we're talking about Africans on the continent or Africans off the continent, those crimes were within 3 periods. For us in America, it was a period of enslavement, the slave trade and enslavement, the period of apartheid, and the post-apartheid period that we live in, which I call neo-apartheid, from 1965. After the Civil Rights Acts laws, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, which supposedly had ended apartheid, Jim Crow segregation in this country. It just morphed into another way, another form, as slavery did after the end of enslavement, slavery by another name, convict leasing, those other things that continued enslavement. So apartheid continues up into this day here in America. So we're in the neo-apartheid age. If you look at on the continent, I spoke about Brother Baba Chinwesu, who wrote the book, The Rest in the West of Us, and Decolonizing the African Mind. Brilliant, brilliant brother. He talks about, he doesn't utilize the term transatlantic slave trade. He used the chattelization that period on the continent where they were engaged in warring and creating wars on the African continent in order to chattelize Africans in the Americas. So he calls that period the chattelization wars. So you have in Africa the chattelization wars, colonialism, and neocolonialism. So you still have these three periods, these three distinct periods of crimes that were committed by these Europeans against Africa and African people. And so that was one of the first things I wanted to get clear. And I think we kind of coalesced around the three periods of crimes. And my brother, started talking about that as well. And he said it's not just enslavement and Jim Crow, but, police terror and the current theft, housing theft and other things that happen in this country. So we are clear on these three periods. And then we're clear on the injuries. One of the things when we went to the Vatican after Bellagio, while we were planning to go to Bellagio, I expressed to the group that there's no way a group of reparationists can go to Italy and not go to Rome and not go to Vatican. Our ancestors would not allow us to come back home if we did that. Because knowing what the church did in inaugurating the chattelization wars against our people through various papal bulls, beginning with those issued to the Portuguese government, told them to go into Africa, plunder and invade the country, plunder their resources, and commit their children to perpetual enslavement. That is the wording in these documents. So you would not have the chattelization wars. You would not have so-called transatlantic slave trade, the Marfa, the enslavement of Africans. You would not have people called Jamaicans. You would not have people called Trinidadians or African Americans or Afro-Brazilians or Afro-Colombians. None of that's none of these people would be on this planet. We'd all simply just be African if it wasn't for the crimes ordered by the Roman Catholic Church. So that was one of the things we wanted to do when we went to Rome, was to lay out what I call a reparations presentment. I'm kind of switching all over the place. I know I have a little bit of time, so kind of switching. So Bellagio, we came away with a series of takeaways, and those things, is on a website, Global Circle Reparations Healing, GCRH.org. You can go and get those 14 takeaways. You can also get a copy of the presentment. And when we went to Rome, we wanted to deliver the presentment to the Catholic Church. We met with the Pontifical Council, Secretary of the Pontifical Council of Culture and Education. That was who we could meet with. The Vatican has as many offices and administrations as the federal government of the United States, probably more so because it's like 5 federal governments or more. So it's a huge administrative body. And so we were able to get before one of the councils, there are many councils, and the secretary of that council. And we delivered the presentment. The presentment was laid out, as I stated, in the way of Durban. Crimes were committed, injuries result, and reparations are due. So we listed the crimes, not only of the war crimes committed against African people, but also this perpetuating this lie of racial superiority, of white superiority and Black inferiority, with the telling of the Ham myth. And that telling of the Ham myth has put this racial structure and hierarchy on the planet that still exists today, where Blacks on the bottom of everything in the world. In regards to our humanity. And that's why police can kill us the way they kill us, because they don't think that we are human, or certainly not at the same state and rate that they feel that they themselves are human. But all this is a result of the teachings that came out of the church. And then we talk about the injuries that exist. The Human Rights Index showed that of the nations on the planet, 80-something% of the European nations are in a very high level of human index, and 70% of African nations on a very low level of human index. And there are no European nations in the very low, and there are no African nations in the very high. And so we see this continued injury. When you look at, there's a brother here in Chicago, a premier businessman, he's an elder now, Tom Burrell wrote a book, Brainwash, and he coined the phrase black on the bottom of every good list in America and on the top of every bad list. And you'll find that everywhere we live, we are at the top of every bad list and on the bottom of every good list. And that's because of the crimes that are committed over these 3 periods. And so we have the indices of the injury of these crimes. And so the natural obligation and response is to engage in repair. And we laid out about 8 things that we wanted the church to do to engage in repair. The person who we met was very welcoming, offered his assistance in helping us move this presentment through the church, helping us contact people around the world who we thought that it should come from the bottom up and not from the top down. So he suggested we build a base. We had, I gave some pushback on that, but, we have to look at it both ways. It's a both and situation. And we delivered the presentment. He had not read it. His first response was, after reading it, that he had to determine which agencies and offices he had to present it to, deliver it to, because, in his words, it raised significant historical, moral, and legal issues of a major consequence. And it did, because it clearly stated that the church engaged in crimes against humanity, engaged in total war on Black people and African people. And all of these are obligatory that reparations are due. So that was major. And we left there and we went to Accra. When I say we, members of the Global Circle of Reparations and Healing. But then in the Vatican action, I was asked to lead that action to come up with a document, which I use to present the model, which I developed probably about 6 years ago. And a presentment, and it's important that I just say what a presentment is. A presentment is used in criminal law, in commerce law, and in ecclesiastical law. In each area, they have different definitions. So in criminal law, it's an informal statement of offenses or of crimes. It's not the formal statement of crimes in criminal law is an indictment. So sometimes a document is issued before an indictment, which is an informal statement of offenses. So that part of criminal law, commerce law is a statement of debt, what is owed. A person gets a final notice to pay a bill. That's a presentment. And so we use the commerce law and we use I use the criminal law, merge these together to come up with what I'm calling a reparations presentment. And I'm hoping this is something that we can use globally, especially when it comes to these other non-governmental perpetrators like institutions and businesses. We used that in Chicago a couple of times against Rush University Medical School, University, and Norfolk Southern Railroad. And we had some minor successes, but the model itself is something that we want to use as we go forward with this work, certainly in this country and globally. So I'm just going to wrap up in 2 minutes with the Accra Summit. There was about 100 brothers and sisters from the African world, and it was hosted by the president of Ghana, and the African Union was there, representatives from the African Union. And one of the major things I'm just talking about several major things came out. Three, the model that I talked about, crimes, injury, repair, that was key. Second was, and there's no order, the second is that African nations, heads of states, must join this conversation at a high level. The same way our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, the heads of states in the Caribbean has taken upon this issue, but you have about 30 million, 20 million Africans total in the Caribbean. Well, on the continent, you have close to 1 billion Africans that these leaders represent. And so it was key that you can't have one African head of state stepping out there like Mugabe did with the land issue. And you saw the sanctions and the inflation and the deaths that those sanctions created in Zimbabwe. He was able to be picked off because it was only one nation, one head of state. So it was clear that multiple heads of state, not just the brother from Ghana, President Ado, but we need more and more African leaders. And one of the other things that was important was this whole notion of diaspora, the continental and diaspora. One of our major international leaders, Sir Hilary Beckles, elaborated on this issue that we are an African people, no matter where we are. And I started my presentation quoting Peter Tosh, no matter where you come from, as long as you're a Black man, you're an African. No matter, what language you speak, no matter your ethnic group, you're an African. No matter your complexion, high yellow or deep dark hue, as long as you're Black, you're an African. And so this whole notion of diaspora is something that they're trying to wipe away and have a discussion about the global African. We refer to ourselves as global Africans, no matter where we're at. And one of the essential things of that is that these Caribbean nations that are Black nations, African nations, should be represented in the AU as an African nation and not outside of the AU. And so those are some key discussions that were held, but certainly there's a global reparations movement, and America is those of us in America are doing our part to push this issue forward here, as well as help our brothers and sisters in the African world. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Kamm. You had some revelations there about what's going on, and that's a very good thing. Let me first see if first of all, Brother Robert or you, Brother Kamm, just put up that book for a few seconds on the screen, and let some people take some screenshots and what's the title?
The title is it's called Laying the Foundation for
Local Reparations. Okay. All right, that's great, Brother Kamm.
Thank you, Brother Robert, for introducing that.
Yeah, we have just let us know how we can get that book too. Let's put a plug in here right now.
So it's on Amazon. I thank Brother Robert for purchasing it at the price that it was. We initially wanted to put it on Nkobra's website for free. Wasn't able to do that, but I'm gonna reduce the price though. So give me about 10 days, and I'll make that happen. So it can be, yeah. So so thank you, Brother Robert, and yeah.
I hope I didn't put you on the spot there.
No problem.
Okay.
So
right.
I think our next esteemed panelist just
Can I suggest that we continue with the intros, because there's going to be a lot of more reasoning, Baba?
Yeah. Okay. We don't have.
Yes, we do.
We do.
Yes, sir. That's what I said.
Dr. Chen is here.
Yes, she is.
We can pass on introductions, because I'm a grandmother and a mother. I serve as the High Commissioner General of the UNIA ACLRC 2020, and most recently have been appointed as the second Assistant President General of the UNIA ACLRC 2020. I also serve in the capacity as the representative from the Caribbean Pan-African Network to CARICOM's Reparation Commission. But most importantly, I'm a grandmother, I'm a mother, and today is my solar return. So yeah.
Yeah, happy birthday to you.
Hence, I'm really grateful. I've been listening as I've been driving and moving forward.
Let me step down and take a drink for that. It's coffee, All right, cheers.
No, I'm very grateful about everything that I've heard. So I was listening as I was driving through part of the rainforest and coming past the ocean, watching a blessed Caribbean sunset And so I just bring that to you. I'm really greeting everyone in peace, Hotep, giving thanks for the opportunity to be able to share a very balanced, methodical reasoning around reparatory justice, reparations, and all the elements that are intertwined, whether we've talked about restitution, repatriation, and all the other networks that are inside of there. I sit in a very powerful space, being able to have brothers like yourselves provide the stability, the foundation, the core, the strength, so that African women can lead and be participatory in these types of conversations. So for that, I'm very grateful. I'm very thankful. It's a couple of things that I'd like to highlight. The other element of the work that I do, sitting inside of Per Ankh and Smaitawi, for those that aren't familiar, the House of Life, the sacred twin regions, coming out of a very ancestral, ancient African, Nubian, New Kushan, New Kemetu heritage legacy, allows for us to speak of reparatory justice, not only in the contemporary settings, but looking even pre-colonization, looking at some of the impacts into this reparatory justice scheme coming out of enslavement, things that predated enslavement, indentured servitude, feudalism, and even some of the weaknesses, some of the lack of strength, the lack of truth, justice, order, reciprocity, balance, divine righteousness, and harmony, grounded inside of some of those communal spaces that persons speak of inside of the continent as well as outside of the continent. So a lot of what I'm going to share will really be partially to echo and support what the previous presenters, Brother Kamm, as well as Brother Robert, have been able to share with a lot of eloquence and a lot of detail, like a lot of the historiography portion, the actual chronology of what transpired. I'm always grateful when persons speak of the Papal Bull, because persons try to keep what was done in these Papal Bulls, particularly of 1453, as well as 1493. There's some 1452 and 1493. There's some serious, when you divide the earth and just say Portugal owns this section and Spain owns this section for the entire earth, that brings a whole different construct to how we begin to look at reparatory justice, reparations, and all the other elements that are participatory inside of reparations. I also think it's really important for the purposes of what I heard as well around the CARICOM Reparations Commission, and I encourage persons to just go and review and look at the CARICOM website, because for those persons that are not as familiar with what CARICOM represents, it is a gathering of the heads of state from currently 15 actual members, and it's expanding because there are observers, persons that have observer status, but may not be an actual independent or sovereign republic inside of the Caribbean. There's been a lot of discussion around the role of Haiti, because there's a lot of historical connections around reparations. And just to get things more balanced in Haiti, I would be remiss if I did not identify that there is a strong reparations, not just initiative, but longstanding for like centuries, right before that term that we're using now, reparations, has been, quote, coined, that persons were already involved in reparatory justice. Like, how do we repair the damage done to our psyche? Let me be more specific, to our psychological frame, to our biological frame, to our emotional frame, to our economic frame, and to our political frame. So there's a number of different elements that come when we speak of reparations. It's very, very, very interesting that many times we will speak of it from a 20th century perspective coming forward, but you had persons going back like far that were speaking of the tenets, the principles, the elements, the essence, the significant components of reparatory justice. And how do we repair this complete destruction? This wasn't just a ma'afa. This wasn't like a happenstance or like a hurricane or natural disaster that happened to African and indigenous people. And maybe I shouldn't say African indigenous people. natural indigenous African people, original people. This is more of like a maangamizi. This is like an intentional, a willful, institutionalized dismantling of the very humanity that we're now defending and speaking truth to power with. This is a very different type of a versation and engagement. It allows for us to also look at a number of things when people speak of, what exactly are these different commissions? What are these different organizations that have been formulated around reparations? And while you have some persons that are looking for the monetary component, there are many persons that realize, not to say that all Africans would just spend all the money in 24 hours, because there's some Africans that are very frugal, very conscious, very knowledgeable of how to deal with large sums of money when they are in their possession. It's just to say that it's not just the fiat dollars that persons need. It is not just the Bitcoin or the Lumi, that it's not just the currency that persons need when they speak of reparatory justice and reparations in particular. It has a lot to do with the resource. It has a lot to do with repairing the actual human relationships that we have with one another, so that when we do have that capital, we do have those financial resources, that we will use them wisely and we will use them for the best possible outcome for all of our humanity, yeah? And that's the other portion that I wanted to really highlight. The other part is that there are a number of organizations that I was hearing being referenced in this discourse around reparations. And many times we overlook, and I say it very, very candidly, yeah, that there are a number of women, and I'm gonna come back to that. And I wanna make sure the persons don't see this as a Dr. ChenizRa vibration, but there's a number of African Queen Mother warriors across the globe that have been at the very forefront, very engaged in reparatory justice, reparations, restitution, repatriation, all types of activities that are helping us to repair this damage. And some of these women are going to the very root, to the very base, the very core of how our communities operate, how our communities engage, how our communities support one another, how our communities develop resources together. How do we sustain economic power? And I need for us to be aware of that. So whether it's some of the organizations that may seem a little to some bourgeois or too elitist or over intellectualized, there's still a number of organizations that need to be mentioned in some of these places. There's certain revolutionary organizations, for example, that focus on the Pan-African piece, that speak of reparatory justice and reparations as an element, but that they don't prioritize that, right? So I would not wish to bring this, in the context of any kind of competition, but there's many that have worked within and through and before and will continue, inclusive of NCOBRA, inclusive of CPAN, Caribbean Pan-African Network, inclusive of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, inclusive of We Want Bonaire Back, inclusive of the Surinamese Maroon Women's Network, inclusive of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, the African People's Socialist Party, of course, the UNIA, ACL, RC 2020, and anyone that's Garveyite driven, any Garveyite, real Garveyite, let me make sure I clear that up, persons that understand Garveyism, understand African fundamentalism, are going to be supporting reparations, are going to be supporting the various tenets, the principles that are connected to that whole vibration of reparations. One of the things that is also really highlighted before I close out, because I know that there's a lot of discourse that has already been shared, and I do not want to just be repetitive in that regard, but when persons think of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, one of the things that came from their ability to glean over what has already been done and how we can move this versation forward, and so that it was inclusive and it was not only in Anglophone spaces, English-speaking spaces, was to look and see what's happening in the Dutch and Papiamento speaking spaces, like in Bonaire in particular. And I keep coming to the We Want Bonaire back because they're one of the few organizations in the quote Dutch-speaking Caribbean that actually has been hosting international reparations conferences, conventions, convenings, public education and awareness programs for over a decade. And a lot of persons won't know because we don't speak, most of us on this side, we don't speak Dutch, we don't speak Papiamento. And it's when they started focusing on making sure there were translations available into English, Spanish, French, as well as their primary language of Dutch and Papiamento, that persons got familiar with that. There's organizations, of course, doing the same thing in St. Martin. San Andreas, people are like, what is that? Where is that? As quiet as it's kept, Colombia still has colonies of African people that are like 700 kilometers away, closer to Central America than even Colombia. San Andreas, Isla Providencia, Santa Catalina. People need to know that we have brothers and sisters there that have been at the forefront of restoring this whole discussion around reparations, reparatory justice, restitution, and of course their self-determination and decolonization. But we wouldn't know that because a lot of times we don't speak Spanish. We're kind of in this Anglophone kind of vibration. And of course, the same thing inside of spaces like French Guiana, Guadeloupe, the French speaking component of St. Martin, which really we should be calling Suliga because they see themselves as one. They don't allow the French and the Dutch to separate them. And as quiet as it's kept, you have reparationists in spaces, even when people think they don't think they're African, in places like República Dominicana, Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo. And I think it's really critical, really important for persons to just be familiar, be conscious that when we're speaking of this global space, and I believe I already heard from brothers and sisters speaking of, organizations like the Al-Kabalan Revivalist, I'm gonna get it right, movement in the UK. We have sisters, like Queen Mother Esther Hokusai, that's been at the forefront of this type of work. Sisters like Sister Dr. Sandra Richards, sisters like African Queen Mother Warrior Isis Amlak, and others, right? We have brothers and sisters, of course, throughout. I've heard Barbados, as well as Trinidad and Tobago, the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago, they've been at this a long time and just celebrated like 30 years of the commemorative festive pieces around Pan-Africanism, which is also inclusive for them around reparatory justice and reparations. I just think it's important that we just remember that this stretches long, it stretches far. Whether it's the Pan-African Diaspora Union, the 6th Region Diaspora Caucus, of which there are many, because we've got SRDCs that have come out of that whole World Congress Conference Against Racism in the early part of the 21st century. And a lot of those civil society networks focused on these same elements that you see inside of the CARICOM Reparations Commission piece. And I just want to highlight for our discussion purposes: 1, full formal apology; 2, repatriation; 3, Indigenous Peoples Development Program; 4, cultural institutions; 5, public health crisis; 6, illiteracy eradication; 7, African Knowledge Program; 8, psychological rehabilitation; 9, technology transfer; and 10, debt cancellation. And there's details for this. Anyone that would like to see this particular plan is easily available. I can put it in the chat, but I'll also put it on top of the Division 330's website with this particular live link. I think it's important to look at documents that persons can kind of pull and glean over, so that inside of our local communities, we are best able to have this not just be another conversation that a decade from now, oh, this is what we said in September 9th, 2022, but to be able to have actionable deliverables that persons can attach themselves to and see some degree of success with. And also the component of having our youth involved, because most of us are over 35. And it's really important to have persons under 35 that are involved in this reparatory justice, reparations, whichever element that they feel a drive towards, because we really need for the youth to continue to be the spark of this revolution, so that reparations isn't seen as like a external kind of activity, like, oh, that's over there. We need for persons to see reparations as an integral part, whether it's art through a lens of Pan-Africanism, through a lens of African fundamentalism, through a lens of African sovereignty, through a lens of decolonization, through a lens of self-determination, through a lens of our authentic liberation and unification using social governance that is about us, for us. I think that I have covered the part that I was asked to cover by Baba Mosi. And the balance of this illustrious panel, give thanks.
Fire, Earth Day greetings, fire. Earth Day greetings.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Thank you very much. You know, you've brought a light into some darkness here that, and I'm speaking personally, to what goes on in the Caribbean, etc. How people, especially women, as they move forward in the aspect of the reparation movement. Now, you mentioned too that something about competition with other speakers, but I want to say that right now I'm in the position of a moderator, but this moderating aspect I will transfer soon over to Dr. Chen, because I know I need to have someone who can pinpoint certain things and bring out more of the information we need to hear from those who are now presenting. But first of all, when you spoke of competing or competition between what others have said, I don't think that it's a matter of competition here. It's a matter of reinforcing. And so I'll go first to Robert. If you need to say anything more in reinforcing what Dr. Chen has said, or what you and Brother Kamm have already said, you can go right ahead. And the same goes to you, Brother Kamm.
Okay, well, I'll definitely try and start off, like, first, like, to Brother Kamm and to the Queen sister, I just want to say it was amazing. To add on to what Brother Kamm mentioned earlier in terms of reparations for not only apartheid and police terrorism, I think it's very important, because I think last year, it was last year, there was an international commission that was set up to track police terrorism in the United States and the effects that it had on people of African descent. And what I liked about this international commission was that it had people who were from different countries. You had Japan involved, Trinidad was involved, Ghana, Nigeria, France, and people from different backgrounds and academic disciplines. And they only examined 20 years. So it was from like 2000, 2020. They only examined 20 years of data information. And it was so egregious. What they found was not only were they demanding that Joe Biden declare a public state of emergency for those of African descent, but they were also declaring asked the UN to have a tribunal to declare some sort of restitution. Because we have to remember, the UN said as early as 2014, at least in my lifetime, when I was around 22, 23 years old, they were saying that the United States owes reparations to people of African descent.
Mm-hmm.
So there is and so we already, in many aspects, have in some ways international backing, at least in a symbolic format. And I say symbolic from the standpoint of, and just to add on to what Brother Kamm was saying, that African leaders need to, especially in the African continent, they need to stop being scared. Mm-hmm. And actually take a more active role in terms of calling out abuses and actively building up coalitions with their members throughout the diaspora. And that's very important, because it's kind of like the five fingers of your hand. Separately, there's not much, but when you pull them together into a fist, you create a lot more impact and damage when you do so. Mm-hmm. And so you know, Chenzi's point in terms of healing, in terms of like the education piece, that's very important. That plays a role in internal healing, because we have to remember who we were before the Manamizi, the great, I call it the great suffering. I know, like I mentioned this at a previous Freedom Forum, there's the Mafa, the great destruction, the Manamizis, the great suffering, because we're still undergoing the great suffering. That's still going on right now. And part of that suffering is because we have lost as a whole, as a collective, of our identity, who we were before. See, keep in mind, like, you know, prior to the colonization and imperialism, what was going on, a lot of the kingdoms that we were building. In fact, when Europeans were going to the kingdoms like Benin, for instance, they were shocked that they were finding irrigation sewage systems. They were shocked finding that even that there was a kingdom so loaded with wealth that the king's horses, each of the king's horses had a silk bridle and a velvet saddle. That is rich right there. And that's a start. In fact, they were even shocked to find even farmers discussing the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. They were shocked, African farmers discussing Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, whether it was Mali, whether it was in Songhai. That was stolen from us. And then part of that internal healing education plays a huge role in repair. The other thing, and this is just something that I think would probably be beneficial, is like naming ceremonies. And what I mean by that is that, you know, just having a name, like an African-based name, you know, is brings a connection to your ancestors. Let's think about it. Like, you know, when we think about like our brothers who have fought and died in the struggle, whether it was Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, right? For those of us in the diaspora, our last names may have been Lumumba, may have been Sankara, may have been Antar or Chokwe. We don't know that. But if we can at least have a naming ceremony where we can have like an African naming ceremony for those of us that actually help reclaim our identity, that way it also plays a role in the healing as part of our identity. So that's just what I wanted to add onto that point.
Thank you, my brother. Brother Kamm, any word?
Yeah, I mean, Brother Robert is so spot on with everything he said. I can just concur with it. And Brother Julius put in the comment about Spain and Portugal. As my sister talked about, Spain and Portugal would be dividing, the church dividing the globe up between these two European monarchies. If you go to South America, you'll find that the two languages spoken the most is Portuguese and Spanish, you know, and that's not no accident. That's the result of 600-year process put in place by the Roman Catholic Church. So we're still living the atrocities ordered by the Roman Catholic Church. And I just don't want to put it on the Roman Catholic Church, but it was these European nations that we all up against. But I just wanted to just highlight that aspect. One of the equally major focuses at all of those, the three actions that I talked about, Bellagio, Vatican, and Accra, was the emphasis on healing. That Robert talked about, and that's in the CARICOM 10-point reparations program. Certainly we must heal from historical trauma, because that historical trauma shows itself in not percent of the elders. The only place you find that same health profile is in the state of Mississippi among Black people. And so the historical trauma was not just mental, but also physical. So healing was an important part to address the historical trauma. But also we focus on healing in the context of Africans and those of us who were descendants of those who were stolen from the continent with some African complicity. that conversation has to take place in a way not to, as some people want to, lay blame on the descendants of those kingdoms and those monarchs. It's the same way it is today. You have leaders, elite in certain countries who, are part of the global monopoly, global monopoly capitalism, I should say. So you had the same thing at that particular time. So it wasn't all the people in Benin or something like that. But we had to have this conversation, but we have to have it in a way that brings us together, as opposed to separation and disunites us. We have to have it, but we can have it in a way that we're all healed in the process. And the third aspect of healing that we kind of discussed briefly was that most people are not aware that with the Jewish reparations, there were three components of the Jewish reparations. One was compensation to the victims and their families. The other one was compensation to the Jewish state, to the Israeli state, so they could create a highway system and naval military installments, et cetera. But the third component that is never talked about is resources targeted toward what they call collective cohesion or community cohesion. They had to create a Jewish state out of all these different European Jewish people. It wasn't just, there were Polish Jews, there was Hungarian Jews, there was German Jews, there's all these different Jewish people, and they had to create some type of nationalism. And they had several organizations, tremendous amount of money was targeted toward that cohesion. We have to also see our healing as how do we collectivize our identity in a way that we see ourselves as one people. And it's what the major work of Marcus Garvey was that we saw ourselves as one people. And so that's part of the healing that has to take place when we talk about reparations. We cannot overlook this whole issue of international national identity when it comes to reparations.
I'm not sure. I think Brother Kamm has an issue with his Wi-Fi.
I don't know.
Bandwidth is low, it says. The network bandwidth is low.
I'm done.
Okay. I think
concluded.
what you said is too powerful for your bandwidth. It's okay. All right. Well, I'll tell you what I'm gonna stop talking, and I'm gonna, unless somebody has any questions for the presenters right now.
You were suggesting, Barbara, I understand that we want to do questions, but we have a couple of people on the line that may want to add into some of the things, like Paul Pumphrey, for an example. I know, but if there's any questions, fine, but I'm just saying, based on time, I know Paul wanted to share some things critical around internal reparations.
Brother Paul, I think Brother Paul has fallen asleep.
I have not fallen asleep. I'm still here.
Okay, Brother Paul. Just waking you up, man. Okay. Go right ahead, Brother Paul.
What I'd like to say is that Africa, by far, is one of the richest continents in the world. And that, in fact, the rest of the world is dependent upon the resources inside of Africa. And one of the things that I think we need to be very careful about is making sure that Africa gets the full benefit of its natural resources. Whether we're talking about agricultural resources like coffee, tea, and cocoa, or whether we're talking about coltan or cobalt or diamonds or gold. Because right now, what's happening is that those resources are leaving Africa at a fraction of the real value that those resources present. And that if we just talk about reparation without putting that into the context, they'll just take those resources, multiply as they have been, the value of those resources that they extract from Africa and then pay us back from those resources. And we'll still have this imbalance of them being super wealthy off of African resources, whether it's not just labor, but also, like I said again, you look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with its rainfall and fertile land, it has the ability to feed 9 billion people a year. It has over $22 trillion worth of minerals in the raw state. Now, if those minerals were refined, you'd be looking at somewhere around about 200 to $300 trillion of value. So if we don't put that in the context of when we talk about reparation, to make sure that in fact, Africa has the ability to process its natural resources and live and accept and use that benefit of those resources, rather than have that value shifted to Europe, Canada, Australia, United States, we were right back to where we started, or almost back to where we started. And so I think that when we look at talking about reparations, we have to take that into consideration. And one last thing, it's just simple fact, cocoa. Britain sets the price for cocoa. They set the price for diamonds. They set the price for gold. They set the price for just about every major natural resources in Africa. But if you look at cocoa, 22 tons, which is like a container shipment, shipping container of cocoa, sells for about $47,800 as cocoa. Very little high-class chocolate is made in Africa. But when you look at the value that they sell 22 tons of that chocolate, like in Belgium, that 22 tons is 3.2 million. That's over a 6,700% markup. That's hemorrhaging the wealth out of Africa. That has to be addressed when we start talking about reparation. So that's just one point that I think that we should make sure that it stays a part of our discussion. Same thing goes for coltan. We couldn't have a cell phone, you know, without the use, at least the kind of cell phones we have today that you can put in your pocket, without coltan, without the tin. And about 80% of that material is found in the continent of Africa. Over 64% is in the Congo alone. Cobalt, they're talking about the batteries they want to have for cars, electric cars today. Again, you got about 58% of cobalt found just in the Congo alone. You look at the Congolese River, the second largest river in the world. There's been a number of studies showing that if they put hydroelectric dams on the Congolese River, it could produce enough electricity to meet the electric needs of Africa for the next 30 years. Now, what would that mean for economic development in the continent? They wouldn't be burning one chunk of coal, you know, or one drop of oil, or using any uranium to provide that electricity. You have countries like Guinea that has over 8 million tons of iron, but yet they don't even have a steel mill. What would happen if a country like Guinea had a steel mill? And how much added value would go to that iron that could be used in setting up railroads to travel north and south and east and west throughout Africa, allowing the landlocked countries to be able to have cheap ways of shipping commodities in and out of their country. I think these kind of important questions need to be addressed on the economic level as we address these other points that are so important around the issue of reparation. And I'll leave it at that.
Solid points, Brother Paul, solid points, because just as there were human theft, land theft, there were natural resources theft, and you're absolutely right. Dr. Chen?
As I sit and I listen, I'm really honored because there's a number of things that we'd like to navigate on what's going on in the international spaces. So I would be remiss, I was listening to a broadcast quite recently. And Brother Kamm, I want to make sure that I have it correctly when I mention it. It was a broadcast that was hosted by Sister Queen and Ketchi Taifa.
Nkechi Taifa.
Yes, give thanks. And again, because just like there's persons in the Anglophone spaces that aren't as familiar with brothers and sisters that are doing this work on the ground, you know, boots like deep up inside it, all of the mud and thick. And because of language, it was just wonderful to hear persons speak about the unification, the type of liberation and the type of social governance around all things reparations, and tying it to international human rights and a number of other, you know, more savvy terms. Persons get a little nervous when you say reparations. They kind of say, oh, a lot of Black people looking for their money, instead of seeing it that it is connected to human rights. It is connected to self-determination. It is connected, which doesn't terminate some, but it is connected to decolonization and all these pretty terms like racial equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion, because none of that matters if we have not repaired the damages done, particularly to people of African ancestry, right? Descent, whichever words are more comfortable in the English term. I really would like for us to be able to share like what are some of the present and upcoming initiatives surrounding reparatory justice, reparations, and all things connected, because there's some persons that still think that we're dealing with reparations like only from a lens of the 20th century, that it's just about getting the money. It's only about getting, and particularly not just the money, but fiat money, which we know the value of, let's say, for example, the US dollar tends to crumble in certain spaces. It may appear to be of value, but when you look at it in its long-term engaging and validity, I should say, and its practical use for our people, there's a lot of questions with that. So there's a number of things, as I was sharing the elements of the 10-point plan from the CARICOM Reparations Commission, that there's also other entities, you know, inclusive of this Reparations United organization that Sister Queen Nkechi was sharing, you know, the work that Brother Kamm has been involved in, the work that I'm hearing from our illustrious colleague and brother Robert, you know, to be able to speak to these things in a way that we can bring it into the now. There's a number of efforts that are forthcoming, and I encourage listeners, viewers, you know, just Google their names so that you begin to see some of the, not even, I mean, some of them have TED Talks, some of them have various presentations on YouTube and other social media, just so that you're able to get an idea of the wide range of brothers and sisters that are involved from a very groundation type of grounding in this work. And that it's not just the, I'm going to say it nicely, it's not just a trend amongst academics who want to then speak of reparatory justice and reparations through an academic lens without having it tied and connected to how it's going to help real people in real times to address our most critical needs, so that we do have security, so that we do have public safety, so we do have adequate, and I want to make sure I highlight that, sustainable housing. I'm not going to say affordable, but sustainable housing and shelter that is secure and safe. Yeah, that persons can have security in food, because we're forgetting if people can't eat, they're gonna go bad. If people can't find decent labor that is equivalent to the services they provide to live in certain spaces, all this conversation that we're having becomes for naught. Because that's one of the reasons why when we talk about reparations, persons like, look, my son, I need to focus on how I'm going to have food, clothing, and shelter first. So if you aren't having a conversation on food, clothing, and shelter first, it becomes a certain disconnect. And earlier when I was speaking of the piece of competitiveness, I say it very candidly, right? Because a lot of times we have brothers and sisters that are not engaged, and everybody comes to the movement in their different sphere. And many times, because we're not on the exact same strategy and practice, it becomes a source of divisiveness. That's what I was speaking to, right? And that's not what I'm feeling tonight. I know that's not what is going to let us move forward. So I'm just encouraging us to look and see, you know, there was a recent international reparations conference hosted in Barbados the beginning of August. And what was powerful is that it was connected in many ways to emancipation festivities and observances throughout the English-speaking Caribbean. What was also powerful is that it took place in the same region of of the Bridgetown Protocol spaces from early in the 21st century, hosted by the Global African Congress with a number of various organizational supports and presenters. I think it's really important to look at what Dr. Hilary Beckles is bringing forward, not only in his capacity as the Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, not just as one who is a sir, and very clearly a very revolutionary sir, right? That was able to still speak to the viciousness, the horrific forms of terrorism that African and indigenous people were exposed to in his literature, in his research, in his presentation, but then the connection that he has in really facilitating that monetary piece, as well as the other forms of resources in terms of education and other supports, you know, economic investments that support reparatory justice, reparations in action amongst brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, and of course, stretching it wide throughout the Americas and the African world globally, right? I think it's also important to look at what works are being done by Ambassador David Commission, who not only serves as an ambassador from the Sovereign Republic of Barbados to CARICOM, but also serves as a high commissioner to a variety of the respective nation states that are inside of CARICOM, and has been forging a variety of supportive mechanisms, you know, through the support and leadership of Prime Minister Mia Mottley around the African world. I think it's important that, and I'm not just limiting it to those particular persons. I'm just using the example because those are brothers that we get an opportunity to organize, work with, rally with, do research with, and engage with in the capacity, at least in what I serve, yeah? I think it's also important to look at some of the efforts that are being highlighted, being shared inside of intellectual spaces, but not making it that it's over intellectualized and it's like only a certain set of persons can understand the vocabulary that people are using when they're talking about reparations, but making it very clear that we have to respect those grassroots intellectuals. And I'm going to say that again, those GRIE, notice where I'm going, those authentic griot that know the foundational core, whether they have academic degrees or community degrees, because some people forget that there are many brothers and sisters in the community that have higher degrees than even those of us with PhDs, LLMs, JDs, SJDs, or whatever, because they know the work from a very fluid, a very pragmatic, a very practical space. And how do we engage in this reparation discourse so that it's not just a discourse, not just a discussion? How do we get these heads of states in respective countries and nations to honor reparatory change? How do we get them to deal with reconciliation on a serious level? How can we still figuring out who has visas and clearance to go into African spaces as African people with the resources that are essential for us to build land, strengthen our culture, get beyond our linguistic differences so that we are able to establish African sovereign prosperity like now, not 100 years from now, not in the 9th generation away, but now. Kind of treat it like COVID. 10 days, you're gonna be in your yard and it turns into a year, 2 years, and the world changed. That's the level that person, because I'm saying this because this is what young people are saying to many of us. Y'all been talking this thing all my life, all my life, all my life. When we gonna see it? What happened to no? Let me come back to English. I just need for persons to be clear that when we're speaking of reparations, that there's a number of different elements that allow for us to take it beyond just a academic exercise or an intellectual discourse. And I know that there are a number of brothers and sisters right here in this framework, this panel right now, that are able to add to that. And I'm very grateful for being able to share a couple of things. And I know that there's some stuff that Dr., our international organizer in the UNIA ACLRC 2020 had shared through what the SRDC is doing with their forthcoming conference being hosted in Panama City in Panama from the 21st to the 25th. And again, reparations is in that agenda. It is not the priority of their agenda because the focus is to get beyond the linguistic piece, because many of our brothers and sisters in so-called, and I say so-called seriously, Latin American regions, Spanish-speaking regions, although they're African, Afro-descendants, they tend to feel outside of some of our movements because what has been prioritized is what's happening in the English-speaking in many of their eyes. So this is an opportunity, and I'm looking forward to being able to share a couple of commentaries on that as well. So I would really ask Brother Kamm as well as Brother Robert to just kind of, you all have given a wonderful, and again, like I said, I was listening as I'm kind of driving and coming across country and right here in I St. Croix. I'm really grateful that you all were speaking to what's happening, in the continent, in Eurasia, as well as in the 48 and the Americas. And I would think it would be very welcoming to just kind of complement that with some of the other efforts that you feel would be supportive for our listeners and our viewers. And either one of you can speak to that as is possible, since Baba Mosey is attempting to shift me into the facilitation mode so quietly.
Yeah, Patrick here. Very effective presentation. I need some clarity from you, Dr. ChenizRa, pertaining to the international or the indigenous perspective. You didn't delve into it, and I would like you to shed some light on that. And the good Professor Humphrey, the question is, how will one infuse, I note the word infuse, the price formula into reparations? Did I make myself clear, or you want me to revisit it?
Please revisit that, because I was missing some of the words. It's probably on my end.
Yeah. I'm saying the good Professor Humphrey, how would one infuse the price component into the reparation discourse, or
Well, one thing is clear. We got people of African descent that are quote unquote citizens of the United States, citizens of different countries in Europe, citizens of countries throughout Latin America, etc. And so the market right now is Africa produces the raw material and Europe processes it and sells it internationally. It's nothing stopping our communities that are in those countries to be the ones who sell it and then provide the resources generated from that to come back and build the continent, the Caribbean, and elsewhere where people of African descent live. So it's not like, you know, what are they gonna do? All of a sudden make people of African descent not citizens of these countries? Of course not. And so we should challenge them on their so-called democracies that they have in these countries throughout Europe, throughout the Americas, and basically work with our communities that are in those countries to sell the same products. I mean, right now you have Ghana that produces 20% of all the cocoa in the world, and they don't make $2 billion. Belgium can't even produce cocoa, and they're making $7 billion a year. You got Congolese living in Belgium who can sell the chocolate just as easy as the Belgians sell the chocolate, if they in fact had a relationship where the cocoa is grown in the Congo, in Cameroon, in Nigeria, in the Ivory Coast, in Ghana, etc. You got, for example, here in the United States, you have Starbucks who are making their billions of dollars off of cocoa, off of coffee, and off of tea. And none of that's grown in the United States.
Yeah, I very familiar, my brother. I think maybe how I pose the question.
Well, what I'm saying is that it means that people of African descent, no matter where they are, have a role that they could play.
I agree with that. What I'm saying, I don't want to carry on the discussion.
Okay, go ahead.
I am saying, and the prices, the world prices, whether in the extracting industries or anything, is being controlled by the colonizers. They set the prices and they do whatever they have to do to manipulate the market. And I'm asking, in terms of reparation, how the representation will make to control the prices out of the hands then from the colonizers.
I would just, if I may add, and I hope that everyone is hearing me clearly. And so I'm going to say it slower than how I was speaking. And if it drops, just raise your hand or give me a message. There are a number of different elements. And I do see that Reverend Dr. Julianne has her hand raised. Is that hand still raised? Okay, I'll just make my comment short because I think it's important to add to the discussion. There are we need economists that are going to provide that layer of analysis most accurately and most proficiently based on what you've just shared, Brother Patrick. And that was one of the things I always encourage persons, because not only is he a historian, but he's also very knowledgeable of economics, to look at the work of Sir Hilary Beckles, right? Because in his analysis, the data was able to be provided of what transpired before. And in his more contemporary work, it provides a very clear, detailed approach to how to address contemporary, 21st century economics, trade, etc. These recent CARICOM African trade initiatives are addressing exactly that. How do we determine prices? How do these heads of state no longer allow the colonizers to determine those particular things? That is not my area of expertise. I just encourage us to look at those that do have that area of expertise and are on the forefront of navigating how those prices are being transformed in our interests, how these relationships and agreements are being transformed so that we deal with trade and economic commerce affairs in a manner that is more positive in terms of the outcomes for people of African. And when I say African and indigenous, I want to make sure that I clarify how I use indigenous, because the ancestral original indigenous people are, quote, African. I want that to be really clear, at least coming from Dr. ChenizRa. Yeah, I don't get into a whole thing of everybody come from a Mayan, Aztec, Inca, whatever. I don't stop there. I'm dealing with the original. When we speak of the world's people, indigenous people and so forth, every August, it incorporates those original ancestral persons that are coming out of the African spaces, as well as those that have passed through Eurasian spaces, quote, Turtle Island spaces, all of that. So I don't want it to be that there's a disconnect, or like we have to worry about how we're going to divide the purse strings when reparations come forward, because there are reparatory justice efforts for original people that need to be prioritized. And what tends to happen, and we've seen it already, we can talk about what happened after the Vietnamese War, what happened after the Japanese War, what happened after World War II, what has been provided for Israel, which is a state, and most of them really have ties to, quote, Jews. It's a whole different, not even the authentic African Hebrews. I'm just saying, that would make us start to talk about things that become very limiting in some of our engagement. So I'm just, for the purposes of tonight and what we were saying in terms of, what's happening internally, what's happening externally, what are some of the organizational efforts that we can begin to bring, some light towards, that we attempt to do that to the best of our ability, and look at those economic indicators and strengths and the research and the data that does exist, so that when we're having these conversations around reparations in its 48 contiguous US spaces, within the Americas, in Africa, in Eurasia, and the rest of the planet, because we didn't even bring up Oceania yet. That's a whole other conversation, yeah? That needs to be incorporated when we're speaking of reparations and reparatory justice, because we are aiming to repair the damage and to have the resources that are essential made available at the highest return possible, right? In order for us to move this forward. Before we even move forward, yes, Reverend Dr. Julianne. Please unmute.
Wanted to give thanks for this conversation. Paul, we were doing this work around the Congo with Maurice Carney a few years ago, and had lots of discussion around our worldview as African people, and the way colonizers convert our ability to see ourselves as a cohesive group. And when we are splintered in consciousness, not able to see the divine spark in each other as African people, then they're able to push leaders into authority who will make bad deals. And the World Bank and other global financial institutions have been playing the game of taking raw materials, manufacturing them, and then loaning countries money to buy their materials that they've already gotten from us. Yeah. So one of the things that I've always been curious about is going back into the original spirituality and the original political systems of governance that we came with, that we started, and developing smaller trade associations in Africa that trade with one another and build our own infrastructure. A few years ago, Billiton, Rio Tinto, and another mining company has escaped me, were competing for access to pure iron ore in Zimbabwe. And at the time they were able to access that, they were basically bribing the elected leadership in Zimbabwe with very, minimal effort, and getting low-cost access to these commodities. And what would have happened if they paid fair price and the remuneration benefited the people so that their hospitals, roads, schools? We have not yet demanded that kind of accountability from multinational corporations. But when we get to the place of emotional and psychological conversion into our power as Black people, and let's be honest, The diaspora there are issues in the diaspora right now. When I was in Benin, there's suspicion of African Americans. There's suspicion, and we're not necessarily in that space of universal unconditional love in the way that we need to be. So how do we, I want to also address this question to Dr. Howard and of course, Dr. Stubblefield, who I'm just absolutely so proud of. How do we get clear on developing emotional intelligence so that our ethnicity and our worldview and our approach to global politics is cohesive?
Well, I will try my best to start off on that part. So in terms of emotional intelligence, especially with handling issues within the diaspora, part of that has got to deal with calling out what's going on. That's propaganda. And what I mean about propaganda is that there's a lot of lies that a lot of people, or whether they're on the continent or the Caribbean, here about African Americans. In fact, one of the things I actually found this out from one of my neighbors, him and I were actually talking about this. This was many years ago, and I was still in high school. And he was telling me, and to provide context, he was from Senegal. And he was telling me that when, him and his family were going through immigration, right? One of the first things that they were told by officials, they were told, don't associate with African Americans here. And they'll go and they'll say things like, oh, because they don't respect their elders, they don't respect education, they only care about music and violence. And that's just what they get when they come over here. When you go to their school systems, whether they're from the Ivory Coast or whether they're from Benin, since you mentioned Benin, they're taught the same things. They even said, don't view African Americans as African Americans, view them as Black Americans, as if they have no connection to Africa at all. That's what they're taught in the schools over there. So when we go over there, whether it's just for vacation or trying to reclaim roots, part of that suspicion is because they've been told that over many years, by the time they're enter schooling around 3 or 4 to the time they're like in their adulthood, they're thinking, oh, like they have no connection to us. And, that's part of that propaganda. So we got to talk about how, and this kind of goes back to the education piece. And the reason why I say education is because my start in activism and organizing was, in fact, in education in terms of trying to get more Black history taught. And that is to show how our language may have changed, but there's still a lot of surviving Africanisms that we still have, like what the way we talk, for instance, and how that influenced the English language here in the United States. Even in the Anglophone speaking of the Caribbean, you will find many African loan words, whether words like okra, Congo, bongo, chimpanzee, or even phrases like the nitty gritty. That is part of the influence of the African tongue, as well as the music, whether it's soul, R&B, some of y'all don't know the sounds of Motown, sounds that's before your time, but like the sounds of Motown, the salsa, even dances in Latin America like joropo, bachata. That is the strong African influence is there. How we were able to keep these surviving Africanisms going on. And how, even when the start of the Black Power movement in the 60s, you start seeing a reclaiming of that African identity, because for the longest time, we were told don't associate as Black or don't associate as African American. The part of it is that we were reclaiming the African identity. In fact, a lot of the Panthers on the East Coast, they were known for sewing cowrie shells and taking African names. You had Michael Tabor, who became known as Catch Wild. You have brother Daruba bin Wahad and Omali Yeshitela of the Uhuru People's Movement. They did to reclaim a connection to Africa and did everything, are still doing everything they can to keep these ties. So that is part of the work that has to be done. The other part that has to be done is shown how they're being screwed over in their own countries. You're so concerned about not associating with us over here or the Caribbean. Meanwhile, you're letting your former colonial powers, whether it was England, France, Portugal, etc., still pimp you out, even though they may not have an overt presence where you live, but they still have a covert presence where you live. So that's just a couple of things that we have to tackle in terms of gene education about reparations and how this affects them and how this fight goes on. I actually have to log off now, unfortunately. But I will definitely, I just want to say thank you all for having me at tonight's panel discussion. And I look forward to the next Freedom Forum on September 23rd. I just want to say thank you all once again. This is a very informative discussion, and hopefully, Reverend Julian, I was able to answer part of your question. So
You did. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So thank you. I'll just add on a little bit of that. Before I do, I just want to also state that the reparations presentment that we delivered to the Vatican is also being translated into Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and French. So that'll be on the website too, because we definitely want to be cognizant of the fact that not all of our people speak English as their first language. So that was key, that we was intentional about translating the document. So yeah, one of the major problems we face as Black people in this country is one around identity. And when we first came into this country, there was an attempt to rid us of our Africanness through the seasoning process and other things. The more you retain your Africanness, the more punishment you received in this country. And again, I have to go back to my comment around the Jews being intentional about building this collective identity, this cohesion amongst themselves coming out of the Holocaust, and to the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who was intentional about addressing this whole identity question of us here in America, creating what he called, what came to be known as race men and race women. One of the major books that highlight the necessity of us going back to that type of teaching is a book by Dr. Amos Wilson, African-Centered Consciousness versus New World Order, Garveyism in the Age of Globalism, which speaks to that whole idea around a global African consciousness. It is the lack of a global African consciousness that has our brothers and sisters on the continent seeing us as they see us, and some of us seeing them as we see them. We also know that Brzezinski in the 1970s put out a memorandum. He had saw how many brothers and sisters from America and vice versa, many brothers and sisters from the continent were coalescing around anti-colonialism and revolution, whether it was ghetto colonialism here in Americas and South and Central and Latin America, or was actually colonization on the continent. We were sharing efforts to eradicate colonialism and ghetto colonialism, and there was an intentional plan by the federal government put forth by Brzezinski to create a wedge between Blacks and Africans. Part of what my brother Robert stated, there was an intentional teaching and plan and structures put in place to persuade Africans as they came here not to get involved with Black Americans, not even live around them. And they were rewarded. There was a propaganda campaign, and they were also rewarded for not getting involved with us. When I was in South Africa in 2014, talking to a young sister on the campus of University of Johannesburg, and within less than 2 minutes, she rattled off about 15 stereotypes of Black people, especially Black men. And here's a young sister, 20 years old, 21 years old, and she knows all of this negativity about Black America, and most of it was just that, stereotypes. And then as your brother Robert said, he had to be educated. And I took another 2 minutes just to share with her the similarities that were happening right there in South Africa, that she was talking about us in Black America. And then she got it, and she understood that, white supremacy is beneath all of this. The negative behavior, the lack of drive, among people of African descent. So a lot of it is education, but we have to have a intentional consciousness re-education program that's part of the reparations. And I go back to Garveyism, race first consciousness, Black consciousness movement in the 60s and 70s, the Afrocentric consciousness in the 80s. And so we had to have a new awakening of a collective consciousness, because that's the primary, according to Diop, historical collective consciousness is the first component of culture. Now, we're talking about a global culture of African people, then we have to have a collective consciousness and a historical understanding of who we are, how we got here, who are the major players, who are the major contenders, who are the major opponents, who are the major friends, major allies. We have to see this globe in a shared fashion, and one that, as Dr. Amos Wilson states, we had to interpret it in our own eyes and to our own reality and to the best outcomes for us as a people. And we do not do that. We do not interpret reality in the best outcome of African people. Many times we interpret it to the best outcome of the colonizer. And we work and we're educated and we work in that fashion. So there has been an intentional effort to engage in a consciousness movement that brings us into this shared identity that was at the heart of the Garvey movement.
So Baba Mosi, if I may, I know what the hour is, and I have put in a request for us to go another 30 minutes, but could we hear from the PG right now? Because I know he's had a long day and he's been with us the whole time. And I do know he has heard everything, and I know he has some remarks he would like to make. So Dr. ChenizRa and Baba Mosi, if that's okay, could we bring our PG into this conversation? Because a lot has been said, but a lot of visionary stuff or work that we have to do. Thank you, Kamm, for what you just said, because it's critical that we tie all of this together in one movement. But anyway, PG.
Hotep, it has been most interesting and rewarding to hear the various concepts as we talk about reparations. I want to go to a point the brother made in reference to Garvey and dealing with race first, dealing with that concept. And because we have to understand who we are in order to understand even the possibility of reparations, and then to get a concept as to how we utilize reparations means that we have to make sure that we build our own governmental structure and therefore our own economical engines in order to make it work for us. The Yurugu, as my brother likes to say, or the oppressor, is not going to give us a dime that he does not get 15 cents from. See, so when we talk about reparations, we have to make sure that we're talking about how we utilize any economic ends in order to further us and our cause of a race first development and the development of an independent African nation for African people. See, we must build the African government, the African infrastructure in order to move forward. That was the plan of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. That's what RC 2020, UNI ACL RC 2020 is committed to, developing and implementing the plan that moves us from having discussions to having the type of conversations. There is a difference, the conversations that are addressing the practical implication and productivity as it relates to reparations. Remember, you're not going to give us anything. So anything that they attempt to give us, they will attempt to use against us. We have to build the unity, build the confraternity, build the governmental structure that allows us to utilize that economical contribution so that we therefore become the foundation of the economic development. See, reparations is only going to be a contribution. And the reason it has a tendency to cause a much disunity is because we get so caught up in a European concept. Okay, we got money, and then it's no, stop that. This is about building the government for African people around the world, building the infrastructure for African people in order to move forward in such a way that the Yurugu, the colonizers, cannot play us against each other. They've done that, and they've done that game well, because we've always defined the game based on their rules. Let's define the game based on the African philosophy and African principles and an African concept, so that therefore it's not about reparation. It's about controlling our own destiny and utilize whatever means necessary. Yes, we have been exploited, and yes, we have been underserved, and yes, we have been utilized in such a way that we definitely should have part of the wealth. But Africa in and of itself is the wealth. I don't want part. I want Africa for African people. I want our economic engine to be based on who we are and based on how we can accomplish it. I want us to say to ourselves, we can control our own destiny. And in doing that, whatever is put forth on the 21st century, 22nd century level, it is be based on what we determine, our direction, our demand. It ain't about a dime. It's not. It is about controlling the destiny of African people. Thank you, Brother Baba Mosey and Brother Single.
Thank you, PG. And Dr. ChenizRa, I want to reiterate, Dr. ChenizRa, a happy solar return. And thank you for sharing your solar return and your celebratory evening with us on this great topic. What the President General just spoke about, both him and I studied under a lot of President Generals, and we always spoke internal repair. And when the reparations issue came up, because without that internal repair that he just spoke about, regardless to what Urugu does or does not do, is not going to necessarily push us forward. However, we still have these movements that we wish to be aligned with, and we want to sign, before Dr. Chen, let me just be clear, we want to sign decrees of Mahat with various different organizations working, as she so clearly said, in their various directions because of what we have in common. And like the President General said, we want the whole of Africa. And when we speak about the whole of Africa, we talk about every African Kamm on the planet. And that is critical to any movement. And then we got power, and then we can exercise our Blacktricity to knock down the door instead of knock on the door. But anyway, Dr. Chen.
I'm recovering from 3 things that were said, yeah. And I'm really grateful that we're even having this type of a conversation, because it lends itself, it just makes me reflect on that there are a number of convenings that are happening around the globe. Everyone here has expressed like different affiliations and alliances and entities. And there's a question that I'm gonna come to that Sister Queen, Reverend Dr. Julie Ann, I want to make sure I get it properly. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly. Robertson has shared just around the Black GDP being bigger than many countries of the world, and how do we capture this productivity and build trade networks with African and Indigenous economies. I'd need for that to be in everyone's mindset, in addition to what I'm sharing. I'm gonna say it again. How do we capture this productivity and build trade networks with African and Indigenous economies? I think that's a very serious question. It's a question that requires, of course, more time for us to be able to share than what we are afforded this evening. However, I think that that should be something that should be like to lead us off into the next convening on this particular theme and discourse, because we're speaking of it in terms of what's said there. What I get from the question, we need to be focusing on deliverables. What are the actionable steps for us to be able to strengthen these trade networks with African and Indigenous economies? Because there are brothers and sisters that are like begging to exchange and do commerce, whether it's for actual products, agricultural products, various services, various minerals. You know, I've noticed that there was this big issue about gold being found in Central Africa, and then everybody went mum. You understand? And that's not just happening in Central Africa. There are other significant resources that are being uncovered and mined and we're not engaged as a unified, liberated, spiritually on point people to be able to engage in those areas. So I just would like for that question. Thank you for that. I see people are putting stuff in the chat. You need to just like open your mic.
Okay. ChenizRa,
Yes.
one of the things we need to talk about is we need to create like an African Bureau of Labor, Ministry of Labor and Statistics, because what's needed, we have to set up our own data systems to actually track all these relationships using library science, data science, and also as well as cognitive development. Because unless we address the actual development of the physical and the cognitive infrastructure to make all these resources together, we'd be still being in the same place and time the next 20 to 30 years.
And that was put very succinctly. I really give thanks for that, Brother Haru, because that lends me to what I was going to share. That's why you heard me talk about these different, it's important to, as we establish these data sets and these archival resources, and to be able to find these repositories of information that we pull on. You heard me say it before. We need to reach out to those economists that have that skill set. We need to find those data scientists, which I'm sure there's several in this space, and just be, and again, it comes when we say these things, and I've discussed this inside of the UNIA ACL-RC 2020, so I can clearly say it to the rest of the family in the world. We have to move beyond anticipating or expecting our sisters and brothers with these skill sets to be able to work a 40-hour job to survive. That really requires 60 hours of their work week in their life, in addition to their family responsibilities and their personal care, and expect them to then find another 40 hours to be able to do some of these things that we're asking them to do without compensation. So that's why what the PG was sharing in regards to having resources and making sure that we navigate very strategically and very sustainably ways to have the resources so that our sisters and brothers that have these skill sets can then, that their work is doing this work. That's one of the reasons that persons, many people that work with the African Union, they get paid. That's their job. Yep. To do these things. And then it makes it flow a little better, right? And I'm not saying it that persons, because this is what people have been doing. We've been running revolutionary movements on part-time, non-compensated prana, right? I just needed to be clear. And in the 21st century, especially moving beyond 2022, and especially from the lessons that we've learned from this pandemic that has affected everyone, we have to navigate and create a new network of even how we do that, so that way brothers and sisters that are doing this work can comfortably survive while they're doing this work, and that it's not making them get to a place of bleeding spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, economically, or otherwise. Yeah. And I say that because that's one of the reasons I know some of the brothers and sisters that I approach that have these skills. It's difficult. It's not that they want to tell you no. It's that in order for them to survive, they've got to do stuff for the colonizer and all the other crazos just to be able to have that extra to be able to give to us, right? So I'm hoping that when we say these things, that we're looking and navigating, how do we prepare that? I love that commentary. How do we capture this productivity and build trade networks? I'm gonna save this one, Reverend Doctor. I just need you to know that. I'm gonna save this one, right? Because how do we capture this productivity and build trade networks with African and indigenous economies comes back to making sure that we respectfully honor the skills, talents, and expertise of these brothers and sisters we're asking to do this. I'm just saying that. Yes,
if I may,
Please.
if I
Yes,
may,
Baba. Yes, Baba.
and chiming in, because all of what is being said, I think, is valuable. But when we talk of reparations, we talk of, to me, the terminology is we're talking of being compensated for the wrongs that were done to us. I want the Yurugo out of my conversation. I want to be able to provide the economical support systems because we control the economic engines that generate the wealth. And if I don't want Britain to say, okay, I acknowledge. I don't want America to say, okay, I acknowledge. What I want a Britain and an America and other Euro or European countries to do is get the hell out of my way and allow African people to control the economic ends so that all the folks that we are now talking about don't have to depend on anyone other than us for their economical survival. Because as long as that economical survival is connected to the engines that have oppressed and exploited us, we have to make sure we intelligently are able to outmaneuver those who already control the wealth. Reparations is repairing what was broken. The person that broke it has no interest in repairing it because it doesn't serve their interests. Reparations has to say to us, let us repair what they broke by breaking how they exploit and utilize us and our resources economically, politically, as well as socially. We have to turn to more to Ma'at, more to cultural engagement in order to remove the chains that have kept us locked in, even though they say, here's the key. Because they never give you the key. They give you a key, not the key. Sante. I've been silent for a minute, y'all.
No, but I know that others may have some other reflections to share, so I really would like to leave that open. I saw that Baba Senghor was making a reference to Sister Nkechi's new podcast.
Humphrey has his hand up.
Yeah, but Paul, we probably want to hear from Paul because a lot of what we were just talking about involves specifically what Paul was talking about. So okay. I would like let Paul elaborate. And unfortunately, I don't have the exact podcast, but if you put in Nkechi Taifa, you should be able to find it. Brother Paul.
One of the things I think that we need to keep in mind is that I look at how other countries or other people have solved some of these problems that we're talking about tonight. And I look at, for example, China. In 1972, the economy of China was an economic breadbasket. And what the US and Europe were breaking their necks about was trying to find cheaper labor than they had in their own countries. So they came to China and they said, oh, can we take advantage of your cheap labor? And China basically said, yes, with conditions. Here are the conditions. You build a factory, you train our people, and the first year you get 90% of the value of the factory, we'll take 10%. But by the end of the 10th year, we own the factory. And now it's our factory. We will still make your products, but we will then use the factory to do what we need to do for ourselves. And then they took something that a lot of that money that was generated and took their smartest students and put them in the universities, studying engineering, studying electronics, studying all the different things they knew they need to do to develop the country. And then they brought them back home and made them professors to train everyone else on how to do that. And now the United States is all upset because China's economy is getting ready to pass the US economy as far as volume of wealth. And I'm saying that we maybe need to look at that and take the good parts that we see out of that and how we can apply that to what we need to do for African people. Because we need to be in a position where we can cut our own diamonds and smelt our own gold and make our own steel out of our own iron and turn our cocoa into chocolate and you know, the whole 9 yards. Because a lot of the stuff is in where we live, whether we're in Africa or the Caribbean or Central America or South America. You know, you can't buy it where they can't produce it in Europe. They can't produce it in Canada or Australia or the United States. And for them to stay where they are, they need those raw materials, or they need to be able to have those finished products. And when you look at the Congo, for example, all the basic products that are made, used to make the high sophisticated electronics, you can find in the Congo. You can find the tin, you can find the coltan, you can find the cobalt. You can find all that right there in the Congo in very large quantities. Over 50% of those minerals are found in the Congo alone.
So Brother Paul, sorry. Brother Kamm has got to leave us, and so does Dr. Chen.
Okay.
I want you to continue, and then we'll turn it back over to Baba Mosi. But I wanted to let everybody know, I want to thank Kamm Howard for taking time out and sharing with us. Kamm, we got to do a lot of more building, a lot of more reasoning. Appreciate the work you're doing. And Dr. Chen, again, happy Earth Day solar return. I know you got the role too. So I just wanted to let everybody in the Zoom know when those two giants disappear, they ain't disappearing. They're going on to do some other work. So go ahead, Paul. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah. So my point is, I feel that when we start dealing with the issue of reparations, we got to look at a plan of how we're going to make ourselves whole from the perspective of where we're not dependent on Europe. We're not dependent on the United States or Australia or anybody else. If anything, they would have to be dependent on us because we got the, not only the raw material, but we'll have the finished products. And when we can get to that point, then I say that's going to be real reparations. Because then we'll be economically, politically, socially independent and do what's best for us.
But that would be more than reparations. see, thank you so much. And I know I'm interjecting because I did my time in listening. But that's more than reparations. See, reparations to me is not the right terminology. Marcus Messiah Garvey said, build the government, build the economic engine. You're talking about building the economic engine. Your example of China was building the economic engine. Right. See, I thoroughly understand where we are today because many people still work and still receive that type of economical support in order to do what they do. People who have the ability and skills are still contracting with and working for the governments that we're saying, hey, we want reparations. Stop the reparations. I want to control our own debt. And I say I, let me make that singular. We as a people have to control our own destiny. Our government has to do what's necessary in order to control the resources and the production. There isn't a cell phone that works in the world without Africa. Yes. Not one. So I want to control the resources. Computer. That's right. So I want to control. I want to control what they take from us and see if we can control that. That means we have to get in the minds of those who are in leadership positions in African countries throughout the world to stop being with your hand out and put a fist up. Because if we can put a fist up, we begin to control the destiny of our people, because I'm no longer asking you to be conscious of me. I am telling you that if you want your world to continue, it has to continue based on how I determine it continues. I should not have professors that are teaching in colleges that are not teaching African students as a priority because the colleges determine how you get in it. We need to determine our own destiny and determine how that works. No one who even has a degree given by a university of the Yoruba or the other European countries or those who exploited us should have to depend on that exploiting country to survive. If we want, and I don't like the word reparations, it is for us to repair our conditions and therefore the demand. Because we control it. We can demand how you deal with us when we recognize we technically can control what you need. I'm just saying.
I mean, like I said, the Congo itself, with its land, with its fertile land and rainfall, can produce enough food for 9 billion people a year, and it's importing food.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
should not be.
Thank you,
My-
Paul. Thank you all. Dr. Chen, I must thank you doubly. I mean, this is not a night you need to be chatting with strangers.
No, we got to say
This is
Kuzili.
family.
We got to
This
say
is family.
Kuzili
No, this is
I'm
family.
just
Dr.
kidding.
ChenizRa.
But
Dr.
listen,
Wait a minute, Baba Mosey, please let me
you
interrupt
know,
you.
please
Kuzili wa nafuraha.
please enjoy the rest of the evening. But
No,
you
no, no,
have
no, no,
with your
no.
family and
See,
all
this
that.
is
with
what
your, and
we
your,
do.
your
So,
day.
if I may, Baba Mosey,
Yes, sir.
let us say Kuzili wa nafuraha
All right.
to my sister Queen,
All
to
right.
the inspiration as not only the second assistant president general, but take
Asante.
all titles away. She's a sister, she's a mama, she's a wife, she's a leader. I say Kuzili wa nafuraha to the
Yeah.
great queen among us.
Yes, Dr. ChenizRa, and blissful evening, and then don't drink too much wine.
She won't.
Dr. Chen, do as much as you want. Just don't overdo it to the point of you mess your health up. You enjoy yourself and give your love to the two generations down, because I know they also been rolling with you. And for y'all that don't know, Dr. Chen was in the States for a while, and she wasn't rolling by herself. She rolled on a triple level with her daughter and granddaughter. And I mean, San Diego, New Jersey, DC, Houston, I'm just saying, and New York, I think, I'm just saying. And now she's back to the ground in the Virgin Islands. So we give a big thank you for you, Doc, for all the work that you have done and continue to do, and give our love and respects to our King Nepkara.
Thank you, PG1. Thank you, everyone, again.
Baba
We've
Mosey,
come to the end of our Freedom Friday Forum.
Baba Mosey, you got to give us a closing. You got to give us a closing statement. Don't just
No.
shut it down. You've been quiet, but you got to say something,
You
Baba.
know, no, this has been inspirational for me, but I don't want to take any more time away from those who need the time to enjoy, or they might have had a very long day. So I had questions, and I did, and I just don't. If I put that question in there, it could be a long conversation. So I'm just leave it. I'm not even going to mention this question. Okay, so thank you again. Freedom Friday, September 9th is over. Yeah, folks, it's been enjoyable. Glad to have you on board. I mean, let's hope the world has heard you, or will hear you if they haven't heard. I mean, if they hadn't heard you tonight, they will hear you later. Brother Paul, a special good night to you too. Yeah. Yes, sir. Everybody else, Dr. Julie, PG, I give you the last word if you want it.
The last word?
Maybe just good night would be fine.
And I appreciate the suggestion, but you know that don't work, right? You do know that. I appreciate that. You saying, okay, Baba, don't be long, and I won't be long. I think the conversations this evening has been inspirational and extremely a building force. And I think if we take from this what came, we, the UNIA ACLRC 2020, and those on this call can help make that happen. We have to build the economic engine for our race. Let's not forget that. We have to build it. And we've had not only suggestions, but directions on building it. So let's go away from this meeting realizing that our job as the UNIA ACLRC 2020, the government of African people, is to build the economic engine that addresses not reparations, but reparative justice, so that we repair our people, control our economics, and then step into the world as the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey wanted us to do, as a nation that represents all African people all over the world. Asante Sana.
Peace and love, everyone. Brother Kamm, thank you again. I hope I didn't miss anybody. If I missed you, Brother P, great to have you on. I see some
Brother
names there
Julius,
that
Brother
Red
Julius,
Heron.
Brother
But
Julius
anyway,
was
thank
with
you,
us.
everyone. Have a good night. We closing. Brother Heru, take it
Blessings,
away.
Hotep, everyone, and thank you for
What's up, my
everything.
sister?